Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. My guest today, Ricardo Semler, is a rather unusual fellow. He started his life as a corporate executive. He ran all sorts of Brazilian companies, and yet he's known as a maverick. In fact, one of his books is called Maverick, the success story behind the world's most unusual workplace. He's also the author of 7-Day Weekend and the upcoming pamphlet, The End of the Boss. So here we have a boss who is predicting, forecasting the end of the boss. He is joining us from Sao Paulo Airport. Ricardo, nice to have you on the show. Would you describe yourself as an anti-boss boss?
Bit of an iconoclast in the sense that I never saw much rhyme and reason to the way people run businesses. And so I think I started very early at 17. My father was already 70 something. And I just jumped into the business world from a rock group that I'd been with for 5 years. And I said, this is very silly. And we're controlling people, seeing what they're wearing, what time they're coming to this, putting booklets together about what they should be doing. And so I think from the very start, I was saying, this just seems wrong.
So tell me your full story. You, I won't say inherited your business, but you were thrown in the deep end by your father. This was in Brazil, right?
This was in Brazil. He'd come from Austria as an immigrant, started a manufacturing business in the shipping business, and made all these equipment pumps and so forth. And he was always expecting me to take over. This was his thing, you know? And so when the time finally came, it was early for me. 17 to 18. He was already close to 70, and he was ready to go. And I just kind of dropped in out of nowhere, and it was all very strange to me. And after about, just shortening the story, after about 2 years, I realized that nobody was going to let me do my thing, which was to take away the constraints and the boarding school aspects of business. And I then said, let me go do something else. And I'll come back and I'll stay on your board and so forth. And I went and tried to buy a ladder company, which had 200 employees. So I had a little bit of that entrepreneurial drive already. And when I was signing a contract to buy this other company for $1 because it was terribly indebted, he came to the law office and says, stop. I'll give you a majority of the company. And at that time, it had 110 employees. It was in a bit of trouble. And then, so we had to diversify very quickly. And long story short, about 8 years later, we had 5,100 employees in 14 offices, and we were on our way. It took me about 20 years or more to prove that you can run a business without any of the boarding school aspects. So we started saying in the beginning already, the 80s, work at home. And people would say, but wait a second, I need all kinds of things. What do you need? I need a telex machine. So we bought 60 telex machines, which were 150-pound machines. And we would send it to people's homes and say, put it there. And one of our guys actually put it into his bathroom. And that's where he sent his telexes from. So we were in the mid 80s, we had shown very easily that there's hybrid work. There's all kinds of silly things that we're concerned with, which were really military structure that was in place and weren't necessary. And to this day are not. If you look at the military structure that we know, it's in business everywhere because it came from West Point to the railroad a long time ago. And since World War II, nobody's done anything of any good with that pyramid. Not in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iran now. It's useless. That pyramid is long gone. And so when I talk about the end of the boss, I'm just saying that the pyramid is no longer useful nor valuable. And so you have to pay the number one person every time more. So when you look at, let's say, Elon Musk's package and it's equivalent to the sum of all of his employees together for 5 years, you say, oops, right? And then someone who's a snake charmer goes to the stock market and says, here's a trillion, 5 trillion, a million people on Mars. And you say, sure, why not? But that is the fault of a system that is not based on anybody anymore, except one person who's telling a story at the top, and a lot of people who are spinning it in Wall Street for somebody's interest. That's kind of silly.
So, Ricardo, is the system broken, or did it ever work?
I think it worked because the idea that everything was moving so slowly, when you think about it, and think between First and Second World War, the French up to 1930 something teaching people trench warfare and so forth. Making that change to now we're doing this, now we have tanks, now we have this, that worked fine for a while. And it worked very well through the end of World War II. Then suddenly you have guerrillas, suddenly you have drones, suddenly you have people who can put something into a water reservoir, or you can have somebody who's hacking. The thing of dragging 25,000 Marines through the mud in Camp Pendleton is an absolutely silly concept, which is kind of left over, but that's not useful anymore. So when you look at GM or when you look at SpaceX, it doesn't matter. You're looking at very pyramidal schemes in which the people who really know something have no interest and no motivation to take that information up the chain. The people at the top don't really have a lot of respect for the whole thing. They're just telling people what to do. And they look at it from an AI perspective and they say, I'm not going to need these people anymore anyway. So it's just me thinking up this whole thing, brilliant strategist, and we'll just tell people what to do. So it's just outmoded.
What are the companies, in your view, that are doing things differently? We often talk about Patagonia on this show in terms of its social philosophy. We used to talk about some of the Silicon Valley companies like Google doing no evil and having a relatively flat architecture in terms of organization. We talk about them less now. But are there companies apart from your own that are recognizing that they need to do things dramatically, radically different today?
In 83, Andrew, I was invited to go and speak to a group of people in Amsterdam at the Krasnopolski Hotel. And there was Anita Roddick and Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's and Yvonne from Patagonia. And they wanted to create something called social responsibility, which nobody had ever heard of. And so I went and talking to them, I looked at it, I looked down, there were maybe 100 and something people. And I said, you guys look like you walked your way back from Woodstock. And this idea is just going to become whitewashed and greenwashed by companies into their marketing cliche, because essentially shareholders and the whole rationale of this structure of capitalism as we know it today is not interested in any of that except as marketing fodder for the cannon. So I'd say there were a lot of companies, Patagonia itself, the Roddicks originally.
Although Roddick is a controversial figure, whereas Patagonia, it's very rare to hear anyone say anything bad about Patagonia.
Oh, and Patagonia is similar to the Mondragon cooperative in Spain.
Right, in the cooperative in Spain, which I know you would know quite well.
So there's a lot of examples, but today you look at Haier, you look at Buurtzorg, which is 15,000 nurses in the Netherlands. These are organizations that have gone the way of the self-management. But I don't think self-management alone is a solution either, because leadership itself has not gone away. There's no reason to say we have to be so flat that we are just cooperatives, we don't need a leader, or we'll use someone temporarily. It's really an issue of, can you have these people validated by people below? That's one question. So we have groups of 10. These groups of 10 people choose their own leader every 6 months, or they validate them with an anonymous survey every 6 months. And the person gets an add-on for being a leader.
So when you say we, Ricardo, who are you talking about?
Oh, sorry, I meant this group of companies that I still have. But we also set up a consultancy business in the Netherlands, which is very interesting, which has worked with now 208 companies that have adopted a little bit or more of this. So we is a little bit more. We did work, for example, at ABN AMRO, which is an enormous Dutch bank, with 400 and something branches. And we looked at it and we said, guys, with a branch manager who's at the top of that little pyramid and makes decisions and decides everything, this isn't going anywhere. So the first thing you need to do is fire 399 branch managers this week. And they agreed. And the only reason they agreed, and that's the reason why more companies haven't taken this on, it's like asking Turkeys to vote for Christmas. There's no interest at the top. It is against their self-interest, let's say that they're going to be validated or voted from below. I'm sure Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg would be terrified of the idea of having the people decide whether they keep their job or not. So nobody's asking. So I think there are many. ABN AMRO in that place is an example. There are examples.
But so you're talking about an endless sort of referendum on authority within companies, that there should be a perpetual churn in a sense. So you're not doing away with, your pamphlet's called The End of the Boss, but there'll still be people making decisions within corporations, right?
Yeah. The difference is it's the end of the boss as we know, that somebody chose a boss, somebody anointed a boss, somebody got $100 million package. The difference is, what are we trying to do here? And we ask everybody, we put it together. We put together a mission or a target or something that people are willing to do. And then every 6 months, we ask the people, every group of 10, is this the right person to continue doing this? If it's not, the person is not fired. The person goes back to being one of the 9. And so it's a very gentle system, which says, we've decided on something we want to do together. Is it collective? No, because it does have authority and leadership, but the person is put in place for 6 months. And they're put in place from March to September. So they can neither be credited or debited for the result. In a sense, if you think about it, it's the difference between Singapore and Switzerland. Switzerland has 7 guys. Nobody has the slightest idea who they are. They rotate, and they've been doing this since the 14th century. It's working out fine. Now, can you do it dictatorship-wise and create a city-state out of nowhere for a while? Sure you can, and Spartacus did too. But it runs out. And a few hundred years is a better example.
So you're saying that Singapore should adopt the Swiss model, that the single authoritarian leader ultimately doesn't work?
Of course, because it's now my son, then it's the son's son, and soon you have King Jong-un.
You've argued that the crisis of our age is 3-part. Correct me if I'm wrong. On the one hand, our education system doesn't work. On the other hand, our corporate structures are in crisis. You've talked about that as well. And you've also talked and written about the crisis of our personal lives. 40% of marriages, for example, end in divorce. Are these crises of education and our personal lives and our corporate world, are they interconnected? Are they part of the same broader phenomenon?
Yeah. And I'm not sure they're a crisis, but let's leave that for a second. But they are one common denominator, which is relevance, for example. You see in schools, people starting to talk about PBL, project-based learning. We're talking about, in our schools, we're talking about something called relevance-based learning, which is if you cannot teach Shakespeare connected to a rapper, you're not able to reach anybody. And people will regurgitate things on exams, which they couldn't possibly take a year from then. And that is true for our personal lives as well. We need to redefine success entirely when we say, will you marry this person until death do you part? That is about the silliest question anybody could ask. And so when you do have an 11-year marriage and it ends, people say, oh, I'm so sorry that your marriage was a failure. What the hell are you talking about? It was beautiful, 10 out of 11. There was wonderful things that happened, great kids and so forth. The cycle ended. And the same thing with career. If you look at today, Andrew, depending on who you ask, let's say my kids, who are, some of them are 16, 17, they're going to live to 100, 110 probably. They have time to be an architect for 20 years, go back to school, do medicine, be a doctor for 20 years, go back to school, be an engineer for 10 years, and still retire for 10 years. And this is totally out of the question, because we're asking them at 17, what do you want to be for the rest of your life? So it's the stupid questions we're answering, and that we're looking at these cycles and saying, if they stayed 11 years in a company, but then they got fired, it was a failure. We need to redefine that entirely.
Well, but work and personal are different. I mean, I know you got 5 kids. Are you on your first marriage, Ricardo? Third marriage. So you got 5 kids from 3 marriages. I'm guessing that in the 2 marriages that didn't work, one of the partners was slightly or more disappointed. Nobody enjoys that kind of failure. Are you expecting everyone to live in such a philosophical manner that they can just move on to the next marriage, the next job, the next career?
If the part of the pain is that they were expecting it to last their whole life and it didn't. So their parents and their friends and everybody's saying, oh, what a shame. Now, if they redefine success as meaning every cycle of marriage or career or job has to be valuable and has to be worth and meaningful, the moment that ends, you're moving on to something else. And if that means 3 marriages, 1 marriage, 6 marriages, 2 jobs, 4 jobs, 9 jobs, it doesn't matter, as long as each of those cycles was considered a success. And if you first consider that the cycles will be shorter, you will have much less pain when the time comes to move on to a new one.
So we need to be what? Resilient? Is that one of the arguments in your way of thinking, that we have to accept that? As you know, you're currently talking to me from Sao Paulo Airport in Brazil, but I know you live in San Diego in Southern California. So you're all too familiar with at least the Silicon Valley cult of failure. Are you suggesting we should turn failure into a kind of cult, or redefine the word failure, not use it as the F word? You figure out other words to describe life. Is life itself just a series of failures in a sense?
No, not at all. What I meant to say is that if there's a I had an 18-year marriage with 3 kids. How could that possibly be a failure? And so the idea, wait a second, you have to be resilient, you have to deal with failure. I'm not dealing with failure at all. I did a wonderful 18 years, which at a certain point ran out. And I have 3 kids, and I have things, and I have memories. And so there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't approach failure at all. It's just another definition of success.
But I don't want to be too personal here, but does your ex-wife agree with you on that? Did you both just walk away and say, well, we had 18 years of fun, and now we're moving on to the next adventure?
I have, with my first wife, I have a son who's 27 here in Sao Paulo. I had lunch with her today, and we were talking about things and my new wife, and who was a friend of hers and so forth. My feeling is that it's not necessary to go the way, but people are predisposed, of course, by society, by all the definitions, to make it a very difficult, long, wrangling decision. But it is unnecessary. That's what I meant by saying that it's not a failure in itself. It's a cycle that ended. I had 2 weekday words, which were kind of gimmicks to think about this. One of them is, the feeling you get, Andrew, when you leave a restaurant and somebody validates your parking ticket, and you say, oh, that's good. They're treating me right. It's not the $6 or $35 nowadays, but it's that. So I'd say one of the days that you look at your days, and if one of them is a valid day, today was a valid day, and the gimmick was today worth it? What I did and so forth, or is today one day that you're just paying your dues, which I call the dues day.
So well, maybe the advice then for people who are in the process of getting divorced, maybe go to a restaurant and have your parking validated. Will that make them more thoughtful about the situation?
I think if they look at their week and they say, look, 5 of these days were dues days and 2 were valid days, whereas that was the other way around. If that keeps going for a while, that marriage is finished. Now, you recognize it or not, but it's finished. And that's the same with a career, with a job,
Yeah, no, and look, I've been through marriages myself, and I've had many careers, all of which ended one way or the other in failure. So I understand what you're saying. There
And
are
was
two.
it failure really? Did they end in failure, or they just ended because they had no reason to go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I need to spend more time going to restaurants and having my parking validated to think more creatively on this. I wonder, the two things come to mind, Ricardo, in terms of your philosophy. The first is a cultural element. It seems to me, again, I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of the most original, unusual, and sunnier philosophies come out of Brazil. Is there a cultural element to where you're coming from? I'm not sure what kind of childhood you had. Your father must have been rather open-minded to hand his company over to a 17-year-old. Did you grow up on the beach in Brazil?
It wasn't the beach or the surfing, but for example, my father in Vienna, when he was 19, he was doing therapy 5 days a week at Freud's clinic, not with himself, but at the clinic.
Right.
And he spent his whole life doing Freudian analysis and therapy and so forth. So yes, he was more open to thinking about what does this really mean. And then Brazil, I think, is easier for you to turn cards over, and in that sense, because people are less dogmatic, it's less old, it's less stodgy, and so people say, "Oh yeah," and I think they're willing to look at it. When I wrote my first book, out of nowhere.
Which one was this? Is that Maverick or another one?
Yeah, it was in Brazil. It was before that. It was called Turning the Tables. I never made it to English, but that one in that Turning the Tables, I sent to 17 publishers and 16 of them declined. And they said, nobody's going to buy this from I don't know what I was, a 27-year-old. What is this, an autobiography of a 27-year-old businessman? Forget that. So 16 out of 17 said no. Okay. The 17th said, sure, let's try this. And it spent 202 weeks on the bestseller list. That's a typical Brazilian phenomenon. It did well in most other places, or in the UK, for example, it spent, I think, 17 weeks. So it did fine. But Brazil was the one that first said, sure, why not? Let's think about it that way. But yes, I think Brazil, Australia, there's a few places that are kind of orbiting the first world and are easier to think about things from scratch.
It's interesting that you think a lot and you write a lot about education, about corporate life, about personal life, but I don't see a lot about politics. Is that because maybe you're having observed Brazilian politics up close, authoritarianism, the rest of Brazilian political history over the last 40 years? You're not particularly optimistic about politics as a fix for things?
When this was 90, so I was just about 30. The party that then put Fernando Henrique Cardoso and a few people in the presidency, they called me and they said, let's look at you running for mayor of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo already had 19 million people. And I said, well, let me see if I can leave something completely new here. Otherwise, not worth it. So can you give me, how long do we have? We have a year and a half. And I said, let me take a year and let me every day go to a part of the city and see sewage and education and prisons and so forth. There was even an incident where I went to one of the women's prisons and I got caught by one of the women, and 8 or 10 of them held me back and they had to find a way, and they were just kidding with this whole thing. But it was all what I meant to say, it's the real world that I went to the hospitals and so forth. And I looked at that to see whether there was anything I could add, because simply taking the opportunity of having being kind of a celebrity status at that point in Brazil and using that to become a mayor kind of seemed very silly to me. So I spent a year doing that with all kinds of groups and programs and so forth, and looking for solutions for everything. And what I came up with wasn't acceptable to them, which was really kind of a Swiss style, which was to say, look, the city is already divided in 96 districts. Let's create a district president, which is elected for a year, which is renewed. So you see here that my thought process is always the same. And my ex-wife used to say, look, you've only had one good idea in your whole life, and you just keep applying it to everything. But that's what this is. That in politics, for me, it was the same idea. You have one president of the district that has to live in that district, is reelected for a year, And the committee of these 12, rotating committee, decides on issues of the city. And I, as a mayor, I help curate. And then, of course,
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the citizen assembly idea that's been resurrected from antiquity.
yeah, or sun, or anyway, the whole rationale has been there for a long time. It was in Athenian democracy. There's nothing new under the sun in that respect. But it is in no one's interest, and I think that is the same thing that happens with the corporations or happens with the armies. You want to ask a general whether he wants to be validated by the people? No way, you know. So I think we're stuck here in the same place. The people who had the power, they were understanding of it, and they thought intellectually it was valid. And
So, sorry, go on.
no, and the reason one of them said, "Look, I have 2,200 jobs to fill, which are confidence jobs once the mayor gets elected. So I have to explain to 2,200 people why I'm not giving them a job." So there's all kinds of other obstacles in politics as well. But in the end, Andrew, politics is really just an expression of where people are going. There is no Trump, there is no Putin. There is 30% of the population that is giving support to these rationales, to these concepts, and then you have one person who understood what populism will do for you, and you get a Viktor Orban out of nowhere.
Or a Bolsonaro or a Trump. You mentioned that your first wife joked with you that you only ever had one idea, or you've only ever had one idea in your life, which you keep recycling. What is that idea?
It's basically that if you take away the obstruction of school kids, of employees in the manufacturing, people who are in the city, people who are deciding on jobs, that people that self-drive and that people will take themselves in places that are much more noble, much more interesting than if you set it up for them.
Is the problem then, Ricardo, in a modern sense, or certainly in a 20th century sense, many sociologists observe this, bureaucracy? Is it organization? Is this what holds people back from your sense of self-realization?
Think about it in the way of Henry Mintzberg or Gary Hamel, for example, and people were taking pickaxes at the idea of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy itself, in a Confucian way, is really the expression, a vehicle, a tool, an expression of the way people are considered when they're considered cattle. And so you say, I don't want to ask people. They don't know. I know better, and so forth. So when you're not asking people who their boss should be, how their work or life should be, when you're taking perfectly fulfilled adults who are electing people, are making decisions, and so forth in a family, and once they get to the company, you say, hey, wait a second. You can't spend more than 5 minutes in the bathroom or 10 minutes on this site, and we're policing you all the time. This boarding school is a real offense to every adult.
In our age of AI, Ricardo, everyone seems to be falling back on the H word, humanity or humanism. You haven't used it, but I'm getting the sense from what you're saying that that thinking of yourself as a radical, you're a radical humanist. Is that fair? I don't usually like that term, but it strikes me that maybe the H word can legitimately be used in terms of your thinking and writing and career.
Yeah, I think if you take the cliches that are adapted to it, I think the idea that strip away all this bullshit and all this that was necessary for the pyramids and for the hierarchies and for the authoritarianism, take this away and let people do things at the time they want, for as long as they want, wherever they want, and you'll be okay. This is how we went from 110 to 5,000 people. All of our offices were hybrid. There was no control. There were 14 offices around town. You could go to any of them any day. And so we had no idea how much people worked. Did they work hard? Did they work at all? Did they work only Mondays to Wednesdays? Doesn't matter, because every 6 months, if you're not invited to your job by that group of 10, it's because you're not valuable. And if you worked extra hard, sorry, that wasn't enough. If you worked very little, that's fine, as long as the results are there. And so it is a little bit cruel in the sense also that it's a bit Darwinistic. But it is a humanistic rationale of saying we're not interested in putting together. Our whole manual was a 10-page set of cartoons about caution and cares that you should take, and that was it. We've never had that. Even when we had 5,000 people, we never had more than that, and we had 2 people in the HR department.
But it requires senior people, or perhaps a senior person like yourself, ironically, to take the risk, because you know better than I do that all this sounds fine in theory and it may have worked out for you. But most leaders are terrified of this, of the failure and the,
And
the criticism that they're going to get. So it really requires
faith. No,
faith and gambling. I mean, it requires someone who, in a sense, has everything to lose and in a sense has nothing to lose.
Think about this. Companies used to last until 20 years ago, an average of 61 years on the stock market. The new number is 21. Of those 21, every day somebody is merged, etc., sold. What is that? That is failure. That is failure every 3-4 years. That's not. And so what is the biggest gamble of all? Is doing it the classical way with the pyramid, because nothing could be worse than the record of companies in terms of their ability to sustain the same ownership and the same leadership. There's no such thing. You'd sit back and you say, Jack Welch, wasn't that wonderful 20 years? Jesus is a shadow of what was before, because he never prepared it for anything except me, Mr. Jack Welch. And that's the same thing with anybody that you would mention today in the tech world. It's all about that one person. And it can't be. There's something wrong. You saw this with Alexander Wang at, I don't know, $500 million, worth the same as 20,000 engineers. There's something wrong with that. No?
You're an education reformer. Your Semler Institute makes all sorts of interesting, or Semco Institute makes, is very much committed to education reform. What do you think of the current education system, business schools, for example? Would you shut them all down, Ricardo? Did they do any good?
I spent years teaching MIT MBAs, taught for years at Harvard Law School. It's not that I don't understand where they're coming from. I do. I think it's just outmoded, outdated, and obsolete. It's not necessary anymore. So we even created, and we're just about to launch this, we created what we call an untethered MBA, which is like an untethered high school, which we also have. Basically, it says this: we have a cohort of 10, can be at a company, can be at somebody's warehouse, can be at a school. And these 10 get together, and they have a whole program on their dashboard of what they need to cover in a year or 2 years or 3 years to get an MBA. Instead of looking at case studies that are 10 years old, 15 years old, and have a right and wrong answer almost, we take the case of the day or the week. So we'll feed you, is SpaceX worth $1 trillion or $2 trillion, or is it worth nothing? And look at it. Here's the prospectus. And so we feed what we call reading the business world every day to these cohorts. We created a master's program where we have former executives, former CFOs, CIOs, CMOs, et cetera, who come on request, on demand, to talk to the group. And they have a software they can take their own cases of life and their own business life and look into it and so forth. And then they need to look at depreciation or retail, this and that. They just call in people, and the cohorts can use the credits to hire the professors. So if it has a high rating and they're willing to pay the price out of their monthly credits, they'll hire a great guy from Stanford or Harvard, and they're the ones who are on demand calling the.
So you're turning things on its head. What about AI? A lot of people see AI as deeply revolutionary, although it seems to be only compounding economic, intellectual inequalities of one kind or another. Is AI the problem or the solution, Ricardo?
I think it's irrelevant in the same sense that electricity is irrelevant or that internet is irrelevant, et cetera, because They're just the tide is rising for all of the boats, and that is the new way of thinking. I think it is already. When I do, when I use, I'm fighting, let's say, an issue with Fable and say push back on this and that. I notice that I'm already having trouble intellectually keeping up. This wasn't the case 6 months ago or a year ago, but now I'm having trouble keeping up. There's some thoughts and there's some ideas that I say, shit, I never thought of that. So I think AI is just an obvious format around us that's there. It's nothing in itself. It's going to get more intelligent than us. And hopefully, we're not going to become domesticated pets over the next 10, 15 years. But essentially, it's beyond us. You can't do anything without it. I think it's silly. Anybody who says, oh, what comes from there is slop and hallucination, that's very silly. We run things now through 4 LLMs. There's nothing left of slop or hallucination at the end of that. And you can't live without it. But these groups of 10 in a company or these groups of 10 cohorts in a high school, they need it. They can use it. They're going to read the world. For example, our kids in school, they get a cohort of 10 teens. They get daily news. Okay. So their new daily news might be something that's happening in Iran, and they're trying to figure out what's happening. They get connected immediately through Slack and Zoom with a school in Tehran, and they talk to the kids there. And they bring in a master from New Zealand who lived, I don't know how many years, and understands the price of oil. These kids are 10 times as informed as their parents in an hour's worth. And so the whole idea, when you see the whole pushback, grassroots mothers, no, we have to, veto the, even in Sweden and other places, no more smartphones and the screens are screwing up. What are they screwing up? They're screwing your ability to memorize the periodic table, right? That's really what you're saying. You're saying no one will study Milton and Chaucer if they have TikTok as an option. So we have a system that grades TikTok and video games, et cetera, during their use of the cohort. And we've mapped all of the abilities and we map it to the curriculum. What do you want? You want a core curriculum, or our school in Baghdad, for example, you want an Arab curriculum, ours in Fukuoka, you want a Japanese curriculum? And we'll tell you what we ticked off. Item on 101.46 when he played Call of Duty. But if he plays Call of Duty all day long, it doesn't go anywhere because he's already ticked that item.
What's your greatest regret?
Probably not pushing through enough with my own convictions, because every time I have these, I end up hearing a lot of people saying, well, there's this and that, consider this, consider that. And I don't think I had enough courage. I don't have enough. I've never had enough drive to become a billionaire. I have no use for that kind of money. The business was already much too big for me. There's already much too much money. It's already a problem. And it's silly. And it's going to foundation and so forth. So I never had the talent, the ability to, make this $1 billion this. But I think my regret is not, and now I'm 67, and I'm starting some of these new things still, but pushing through them with absolute conviction that we're going to get to the end is something I don't have. So I'm not those make it or bust entrepreneurs. I end up being a little bit more conservative, which I think bothers me.
And then what most frustrates you? I mean, you're clearly an idealist, an iconoclast, as you say. You think very differently to most people, and you behave very differently to most people. But is there stuff that frustrates you, particularly in human nature? I mean, you present this as if it's all obvious, and if we were all in these small teams, the world would be a better place, and you may well be right. But what most frustrates you about people? What would you change if you could flip a switch?
I think that the cattle aspect of fear, I think, is the one thing that probably holds everything back, because it's wonderful to see people. I had an incident today before I came here to the airport. I was talking on the cell phone on the corner, and a motorbike came up on the sidewalk, And the guy tried to snatch my cell phone, which is a typical happening in Sao Paulo. People are all looking, what's this stupid gringo here talking on his phone in the middle of the street? But I grabbed it back. I don't know what happened, some kind of reaction. I grabbed it back and the guy went off. So you think, oh, son of a bitch, these criminals. It never occurs to me. I think humanity is a wonderful set of people who are pushed into situations. But I think it's accepting the idea that there's nothing you can do. If you look at today, all of the dictators that are in place, right? In America, in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, wherever you go, and decreasing amount of them, somebody's feeling okay with being dictated, and a new absurd surrealism where you said, did he actually say that? Everything sounds like fake news. Every time I see a real comment from any of these guys, I think it's fake news. So I think it's more that humanity tends to fall back into this role of, okay, let's see what's going to happen. And I can't really do anything alone. I think that's the bit that I would change if I could.
And finally, Ricardo, you said you were 67 years old. For people watching, you look a very young 67. Spending a lot of time, I'm sure, on the beaches of Brazil or San Diego. You also noted that people are going to live to 100, 110. Say you live to 110, so you have another 40, 45 years left. What haven't you done that you still want to accomplish in your life?
The personal things that have been left to the side, because I started working at 17, I started going crazy and so forth. When I was 21, I was visiting a plant in New York, a manufacturing plant, and I fainted. So they sent me to Lay Clinic in Massachusetts, and I spent 3 days there, according to the guy, amortizing all of their machinery. At the end of that, I said, what's wrong with me? He had a big stack of things. He said, absolutely nothing. He said, let me show you something. He took me to the cardiac ward, and there he said, look at the menu. And I said, why am I looking at the menu? He said, see, there's white omelets and all this stuff. And I said, why am I looking at this? He said, because you're going to be using it very soon. You're the most advanced case of stress I've seen at 22 years old and so forth. So what do? He said, take an aspirin, 2 aspirins 8 times a day. I said, what's that going to do? He said, absolutely nothing. It'll remind you 8 times a day that you have a big problem to solve. So I went back. I was leaving the office at midnight and so forth. And I said, I'm going to retrace Marco Polo's route. And that took 100 days, 102 days to do, in a time in which there was no communication possible. And I spent a lot of that time buying and selling camels and going over to the Taklamakan Desert and so forth. And that brought me to a point I stopped using watches exactly then. And I said, shit, I can't measure this in minutes and dollars and metrics, et cetera. There's got to be a better way. And so I'd say what's left for me, be it 10 or 20 or 30 years, whatever I've left, is figure out a way to slow down this rationale ahead that's always, oh, I can do that too. Let me start a project. Let me do schools. Let me do this. Let me do a new book. And that part I haven't learned yet, even spending a lot of time. I just spent again 2 weeks in a monastery in Morocco, spent 2 weeks in a monastery in Japan. So I'm trying hard, but it's very far from me still to be able to calm the mind, et cetera. That's the one thing I'd rather do.
Well, I don't have a boss, but if I was going to have one, I wouldn't mind having Ricardo Semler. He seems the most anti-boss-like boss imaginable. In fact, one of his new pamphlets is The End of the Boss. Ricardo, lovely to talk to you. A very refreshing, innovative conversation. And best of luck with everything you're doing. I hope you'll come back on the show in the next 40 years.
Would love to. I'd hopefully not 40 years, even before that. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.